Smoke signals from around the campfire.
Hi, my name's Rob Cooper. I'm a former police chief superintendent from Devon in Cornwall, and I now find myself a member of Extinction Rebellion. Quite an interesting journey. I'm a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, so I quite often get asked why have I changed sides, and I just say, well, I haven't changed sides. When I joined the police, I joined to protect the community, and that's the same reason I joined Extinction Rebellion. I genuinely feel now that because of government inaction, I think we are in real danger of, some very ominous climate change, and I'm here to call the government out and hopefully get them to change their ways and not stop the impact because it's already here, but try and reduce it as much as we can.
Is Extinction Rebellion your first foray into activism?
It is, yeah. I guess, as a police officer, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to take part in any kind of active protests, so I clearly didn't. Having said that, I've been retired for 10 years, and during that time I've obviously kept up to date with some aspects of climate change. I think the learning curve has got very steep in recent months, but as to during those 10 years, as to whether I was actually going to join any kind of active group, but to be honest, I never even considered it. I've a lot of respect for Greenpeace activists that climb on oil rigs, that sort of thing, but I was just one of those members of the public who thought, things are changing, but they're not as bad as I now realise they are, and perhaps I was quite naive to think that something would be done, and then I saw the April rebellion in London, and that was my wake-up call, really. What I do like about Extinction Rebellion is they're not what I would call a single issue group. They don't go chasing this initiative or that idea, because those things aren't going to achieve the big change, whereas Extinction Rebellion are quite serious and quite rightly saying the only way to make a difference is to get change initiated from the top. So governments have to recognise the emergency, and then they have to act on that emergency. And being somebody that's dealt with major incidents, emergencies, obviously not on this kind of scale, but nevertheless, having dealt with emergencies, I recognise that that is absolutely the case. Somebody at the top has to grip this and deal with it as if it's the only thing that matters, because it is, quite frankly.
We were both at the People's Assembly in Parliament, which was quite a landmark occasion, but I remember you making a point about there is a window of opportunity to act,
Yep.
and the urgency with which you expressed that was very prescient.
As I recall, I made reference to the golden hour, which is what doctors or the NHS refer to when they're dealing with critical incidents, the need to provide critical care. And I then went on to say that with major incidents, serious incidents, the first period of time is always about generating some kind of order out of chaos and trying to catch up with the incident that you're dealing with, and we are a long way behind. Just in the press in recent days, there isn't a single country that signed up to the Paris Agreement that's actually achieving anywhere near achieving any of its pledges. So that's a pretty damning indictment. And this government previous Prime Minister that set a target to reduce, go carbon neutral by 2050 with no plan. You know, it's just ridiculous. You cannot achieve a target of this scale without a plan.
So XR is essentially non-political in that it's not tied to a particular party, but it's very much in favour of systemic change. Is there an official line on, for instance, we're in a general election campaign period, and how that should be handled?
Yeah, I think in terms of the next 5-6 weeks, then Extinction Rebellion will be very careful not to endorse any particular parties. Having said that, there is a party that's been in power for the last 10 years, so they have a track record, and it's only right and proper that the public should be made aware of that track record. And you know, just in recent times, with the appointment of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, you know, in my view, he's had at least 3 opportunities. The first, when he stood outside Number 10 and made his first speech. The second, at the Conservative Party conference. And the third, when they launched the general election. So he's had 3 opportunities to state what his priorities are. And the biggest crisis facing humanity is not in his top 4. You know, and I just find that ridiculous, beyond ridiculous. You know, words fail me, to be honest. And at times like this, I think about my granddaughter. She's 6 years old. She's too young to vote. She's got an understanding of some things around the climate and various issues attached to the ecological side of things. But you know, she doesn't have a voice, and yet it's her future that this election is all about. And the lawyer who was at the court case to do with the Section 14 Trafalgar Square issue actually said the IPCC are talking about 10 years to reduce pretty much by half our carbon emissions. The next government could be in place for half of those 10 years, the next 5 years. So we need to choose the next government very, very carefully, or else, quite frankly, we're screwed.
I've certainly noticed from some of the Labour rhetoric that they're recognising it, their priority now in the last few days, even though they still call it climate change and not climate breakdown or whatever. What's it going to take to wake up politicians, and what sort of budgets are we going to need? What sort of policies to start to combat the fossil fuel predominance that's still there?
I mean, this is probably, I mean, just to reframe the question, you know, why is it tens of thousands of people are willing to take to the streets, sleep in tents in Trafalgar Square or in tents in Hyde Park, and just march around London for 2 weeks, get themselves arrested? Why are they prepared to do those sorts of things in the name of action around climate change, when our own government, with all the briefings they could ever wish for and the access to all the science they could ever wish for, just don't make the right kinds of decisions? That is the thing I think about the most. I'm trying to understand why they won't declare a climate emergency, why they won't do the right thing. And there may be several reasons. None of them are good reasons, but I think I guess what matters is what needs to be done to make the change. And I think at the moment it's easier for those in power to stick with the status quo, or business as usual, as we call it, because to make the changes that are needed will impact the stock market, will impact the multinationals that have funded various aspects of the establishment for many, many years. These are, I don't. When I say I want the government to declare a climate emergency, I don't say that glibly. I do recognise the challenges. But also there's a huge frustration because they constantly say one thing and then do another. And just to take fossil fuel subsidies as an example, in 2009, the G20s, 20 biggest economies in the world, agreed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies because it was recognised that this is what's holding back change, and the belief that polluters should pay, and we need to incentivise change. Those sorts of reasons, it was agreed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and here we are 10 years later, and our government is giving £10.5 billion a year to the oil and gas industry. And so, words in 2009, but no action in the ensuing 10 years. And it's just not good enough. And it kind of gets even worse. It sounds a bit Star Trek-y, but the projections for Shell and ExxonMobil over the next 10 years are to increase productivity by 35% when we should be reducing carbon emissions by 45%. So these companies are receiving taxpayers' money to actually fuel climate breakdown. It is just ridiculous. And there are more examples of where the government does one thing and then says another. They temporarily stop fracking and then they give planning permission to a coal mine in the same week.
And we're still paying for the legacy of the last several decades, which there are a lot of unknowns there.
Yeah, so it's not going to be easy for them. It's a bit like, it's maybe not a good analogy because it's a super tanker full of oil, but trying to get a super tanker to stop or even change course. Very, very challenging to actually make a system change rather than just deal with climate change, because that is what's needed.
And how far into that are Extinction Rebellion going at the moment? There's a recognition that we need systemic change, but in terms of the detail about how we change the economics, I saw a brilliant lecture by Kate Rayworth, the author of Donut Economics, which related economic theory to the futility of growth in terms of how we're damaging the planet, how that needs to change. I get the sense that we need to be paying a lot more attention to the actual mechanisms and structures, new frameworks.
I think with many examples of change, things start very slowly, and then if it's the right time, then momentum builds, and then before you know it, things have changed. I've probably seen the same lecture by Kate, but the big challenge is virtually every person that lives in this country. You may as well stop calling them a citizen and call them a consumer, because that's what they are. And we need to change virtually every aspect of the way we live. Now, the public are getting alive to this issue, and more people are, ripping the plastic off in the superstores and leaving it behind, that kind of thing. But then the next challenge might be, how many flights do you take every year? What kind of vehicle have you got? But this is why I really do agree with XR, because it comes back to the government, and the government can incentivise change through taxation, subsidies, and just to take the example of electric cars, I was in Scotland during the summer, and I said to my wife, I said, there's so many electric cars around, and when I actually looked into it, I then found out that you can buy an electric car in Scotland with a interest-free loan from the government, but you can't do that in England. And it's just a simple thing, but it's just one example. I'm not saying it's going to solve the problem, but it is a good example of how if the government makes the right decision, there is a definite ripple effect, and the public will respond. So that just brings me back to, that's why I'm committed to getting the government to actually to change, and irrespective of which government it is, it's not going to be easy for them, but we just need to keep giving them the encouragement, giving them the nudges, and if they don't accept the encouragement, then we have to push harder and harder. We're just getting to the point now where words mean very little. What we want is commitment followed by action very quickly, and even the most recent climate conference in New York with the United Nations, the Secretary General said, you're only going to speak if you've got something to say which is going to be translated into action. I think the expression he uses, I don't want fancy words, and absolutely right. As an ex-police officer, I would never have the luxury of standing around looking at a critical incident, a major incident, and just talking about it. You have to get to it. You have to decide what needs to be done, and then you have to deal with it. And this government is just taking far, far too long to do that. I think if it was viewed by the people in government as a humanitarian issue, I think they would have made the changes already, because they would get it. Sadly, I think they don't see it in a humanitarian way, so then it becomes a political issue, and then that comes back to, we need to make it easier for them to do the change and harder for them to carry on with business as usual. And that's why Extinction Rebellion take to the streets and just won't go away, because we need to keep on and on until it literally becomes the easiest thing to do, to reach across and take the file out of the too difficult to do basket. And we've all got examples at home where we've got things to do and they're just not getting done, and then of course it comes more and more into the conversations, and in the end you just realise it's easier to get the job done than it is to keep putting it off. Mine's the gate on the side of the house, in case you're wondering.
Are you supportive of all the actions that XR have been doing? For instance, in this third London rebellion that's just happened, there was a lot of controversy around the Battle of Canning Town.
Yeah.
What was your view on that?
Personally, I think it was ill-judged. I think XR did what they could to try and garner the views of other rebels, and as I understand it, there was quite a strong message that it would be inappropriate to do on a number of levels, not least of which because it's a mass transport system, which is something that should be celebrated, not frustrated. But of course the location as well, these are just ordinary people trying to get to work. But at the same time, if you look at the reaction, these are the kinds of reactions that we're going to have when there are food shortages, when the underground is flooded because of sea level rise. So, I don't agree with that particular action, but at the same time, just to try and take something from it, this is a sign of what could come in the future. Overall, I think that the question during the autumn uprising was, where's the plan? And I think that was a well-framed question. It's 6 months since Parliament declared a climate and ecological emergency. 6 months is ample opportunity for the government to, realise that something needs to be done. And nothing has been done substantially by the government. So I think it was entirely appropriate to ask that question. And XR made sure that it visited all of the departments of government and obviously spent some time outside number 10 as well to ask that question. And we still don't have an answer. In fact, the Committee on Climate Change posed pretty much the same question to the government, and they've said in a press release, this is Chris Stark, the chief exec from the Committee on Climate Change, they've said that as they understand it, the government has a plan for a plan. Well, that's just not good enough when we're talking about an emergency, when we're talking about the need to actually get a grip of this within the next 12 to 18 months. And we really have 10 years after that initial period of time, 10 years to actually put things into place to make a difference. And when I say make a difference, I'm talking about not restoring what we had. It's already too late for that. We are already looking at global warming of at least 1.5 degrees. I think it's going to get warmer than that. And I think we're going to have to work really hard. And that's a concern I have, is where there is a definite lag behind reality. So the science that we refer to now is science from the Paris Agreement, science from the UN conference in New York, and that science is already 12 months old at least. And 2019, in terms of climate change, was one hell of a year. There's temperature records being broken everywhere. The Greenland ice sheet shed more ice than it's done ever before. I saw a film from an American news reporter flying across Russia, and that film showed fires in the Arctic which literally spanned time zones. And where the earth thawed, there was earth slips everywhere. They're talking about buildings are now collapsing because the ground on which they were built, permafrost, is now melting. Heat waves in Europe, crop failures, floods, hurricanes, typhoons, all in the space of not even 12 months, it's more like six to 9 months. And that's one of the things I think about with the Prime Minister, is he was appointed in August, I think it was, and so I thought he's not going to concentrate on anything else apart from Brexit, and then he starts making announcements about the police, NHS, education. I thought he is thinking about other things, so surely he's going to say something about climate change, but no. He made reference to a few green buses and a lithium battery factory, but that was it. And then I think, actually, when he made those announcements, we were in the middle of, or had just had, heat waves, temperature records tumbling all over Europe, the dramatic ice melt that I'm talking about, the Arctic wildfires, you know, and he went to Whaley Bridge. He actually went and looked at a dam that was broken by an extreme weather event, and he still doesn't put the climate emergency in his top flagship policies, and it's unbelievable. And for that reason, I say he doesn't get it in a humanitarian sense. So in order for him to change, we have to make it that it's unavoidable in the political sense. So that's what we're trying to do.
So we better get out on the streets and rebel. Is that going to be legally possible in view of the court ruling this week? How did you feel about the way the October Rebellion was policed?
To be honest, as an ex-police officer, not a lot of what happened surprised me. I thought they would do something different, the police, and they did. They made use of common law powers as well as the Public Order Act, and I see why they did that. But at the same time, it was disappointing because the police liaison, which goes on before the event and during the event, is intended, and this is obviously both sides coming together and having discussions, it's intended to minimise disruption, to try and ease the strain on the police, and their more proactive style of policing meant that the protesters couldn't settle, and so the expression, you know, be like water, it didn't come just from what's happening in Hong Kong. It was a reaction to the police's more robust style.
For those who haven't heard that expression, can you explain?
Yeah, of course. So the expression "be like water" in the April and July rebellions, then camps were established, and you know, people were going to stay in a very settled environment, location for a period of time, and then go off and do things from there. But because the police wasn't allowing that to happen, then it was more a case of go somewhere, do something, and then when the police arrive, then just disappear, dissipate, and then resurface in a different place. So try and stay one step ahead, if you like. But then the unfortunate side of that is it does make the police's job more difficult. You know, so that there's a bit of antagonism creeps in, which is not necessary. But I think as to the ruling around the use of the Section 14 order at Trafalgar Square, which effectively then, Trafalgar Square was the last area that protesters could actually stay and not infringe the law. Yeah, on the second Monday of the protest, the police decided that they would also include Trafalgar Square in the Section 14 order, and that effectively meant the whole of the City of London and Greater London was an area where people were not allowed to assemble and protest, and there were a number of arrests made after that order was put in place as well. So it was deemed by ex-our lawyers that was a step too far by the police, and I think most people saw that, and it was found in the High Court that was the case. The police had overreached, And so the interpretation of the Public Order Act has been developed by the findings of the judges. We now understand that one order cannot encompass several sites at different times of the day, or indeed different days. It can only deal with one particular site or event. So that's a useful clarification for both protesters and the police. But there's also an implication in terms of the police are now saying that we should review the law because the law is from 1986, and that law was drafted not long after there were a number of serious outbreaks of disorder, so not disruption but disorder. Shops were looted, cars were set on fire, people were attacked, etc., etc. So it was written for a very different kind of event. Now, I'm not surprised that the police say the legislation should be looked at again. What would be interesting is how that review is conducted, because if it is just conducted within the Home Office, I think that's contentious, because our protests have been against the government, and of course the Home Office is just a department of government. So I think if there is a review of the law, which I don't disagree with, then I think it should be done by an independent body, maybe calling in people from the judiciary to carry out that review.
Going forward, what's next? What should XR be doing? What should we all be doing?
Well, I guess the immediate next thing is the general election. So Extinction Rebellion are working on plans. I can't tell you what those plans are because they're not finished yet, but they are working on plans as we speak under the hashtag of Election Rebellion. What should we all do? I think we should all, if we're eligible to vote, so if we're 18 or over on the day of the election, we should make sure we're registered to vote, and we should consider how we vote, and I would encourage everybody to vote, but I would encourage everybody to use that vote wisely and vote for the future, because of course that's one of the limitations of government is governments tend to live from one general election to the next, and that's why XR wants to introduce citizens' assemblies, is to get away from this short-termism. And I think this election is a definite case of where the voters need to think not about the obvious short-term issues, but about the real big long-term issue that we face with climate emergency. So look at what the parties are offering and choose wisely.
Would you say that Westminster politics is broken? Do we need a new political system that is more based around citizens' assemblies, people's assemblies?
Wow, that's a big question, isn't it? It doesn't matter what I say. I suspect some people will agree with me and some people will disagree, but in my view, some elements of it aren't working very well. I think at the moment there's too much power, or the government perceives itself as having more power than it should have. And I actually think Parliament has done the right thing in terms of reining in the government. And also, I think let's not forget that there's been some quite interesting court cases recently as well, and they've tended to reinforce the notion that Parliament is the sovereign establishment and not the government. The government is the executive. They're there to do the job, but that doesn't mean they should have all the power. And the Supreme Court has made that very clear. So I think there has been some of the behaviour, and now as a result MPs are getting a lot of abuse, their offices are being damaged, and I think that's awful. The number of people that are actually leaving Parliament this time around because they just say it's no longer for them, I think that's a real indictment. So I think that needs to change. But I think Parliament has actually done some good things. I'm not necessarily in terms of the outcome that we now have with this particular general election, but just reining in the power of the executive. And as to where we go in the future, I do think we need to get away from adversarial, predominantly two-party politics. As I understand it, the benches in the Houses of Parliament are just far enough apart so that people can't stab each other with swords. And maybe we've kind of we've put the swords away, but the rhetoric, the abuse that gets flung, in terms of an example to everybody else in the country, then we can do a lot better. That thing about Boris Johnson, I mean, it's a bit dated now, but I think it just goes to evidence the point that he doesn't really give a about climate change, because he's had ample opportunity and it's been happening all around him while he's been thinking about what are my issues. But there are some interesting people popping up. So the governor of the Bank of England has made several references to the climate emergency, and it was only, I think, last month where he gave evidence to a Treasury Select Committee, and he said if you look at current projections, and I'm not quite sure how he does this, but if you look at current projections, he's saying we're probably heading, and his words pretty much, he's saying we're probably heading somewhere north of 4 degrees of warming if we carry on with business as usual. Now that's hot house Earth, that's cataclysmic. So when I hear somebody like him talking about climate change and having some, what he says indicates he's got some knowledge and understanding, and he also goes on to say it wouldn't take much for the government to, through taxation regulation, to incentivise change, then I'm encouraged by that, because he is a very powerful individual, but of course he's also at the end of his tenure, so who's going to take his place? So there are people in places of power and influence who do understand climate change, and they are doing things to try and make a difference, and maybe he's one of those.